other words, if you want to stay in the game and stay alive, you've got to sacrifice more Ukrainian soldiers in a pointless counterattack. The other thing that's happened over the last several months is almost total annihilation of the. So the Russians have almost, I would say, an inexhaustible mountain of ammunition, missiles, rockets, aircraft, bombs, you name it. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, as has been pointed out, are running out of. Once a decision was made in the summer to begin establishing what I would call a strategic defense in southern Ukraine and to run the defense as an economy of force measure, they needed more unity of command than they had at the outset. And remember, at the outset, the Russians really did not have a very large force, and the force they sent into Ukraine was quite small. It was designed to essentially signal seriousness to the West. That all failed miserably. So the Russians had to go back and re-examine all their original underlying assumptions. The new assumptions in the fall of last year were, under General Surovikin, we're going to establish this defensive line, and then ultimately we are going to invite the Ukrainians to attack it. And with any good fortune, the Ukrainians will do so and bleed themselves. Now, what's happened in Bakhmut in particular, which gets so much attention, it's almost in the center of that strategic defense line. Bakhmut became a bloodbath for the Ukrainians because the Russians deliberately left roads open, access to it, in the hopes that the Ukrainians would indeed pour large numbers of their forces into it. Because Bakhmut was, from an operational standpoint, important, given its railroad nets, road nets, connectivity to the rest of eastern Ukraine. All of that has now come to an end. Surovikin was very successful, and I think when this war ends and we go back and look at it, Surovikin will end up being the individual that is remembered for his wisdom to defend southern Ukraine as opposed to make incremental gains over a long period of time, because there was great pressure inside the Russian general staff to make continuous gains to show that the Russians were winning. And Surovikin said, that makes no sense. Our first priority has to be to defend, invite the Ukrainians to attack, to kill as many of them as possible, and then secondly, to build up our reserves, to take in the 300,000+ reservists, train them, integrate them, assimilate them, so that we have a much larger combat force ready to fight. Now, there was an attempt to try and get that ready before January and February, and as you point out, the winter simply didn't come to fruition. We never had 2 weeks of solid freeze. In order to, as your viewers probably are aware, the black earth in eastern Ukraine is topsoil that goes down perhaps anywhere between 10 and 20 feet at virtually every location. And this topsoil is remarkable. As many Ukrainians and Russians have pointed out to me, you can stick a tire in this thing and it will grow something. It's just incredibly fertile. But unfortunately, the depth means that you have much more than a sea of mud. I would call it an ocean. And the ocean never froze. When it freezes, you can fight in the winter. If it doesn't freeze, which is what really happened to us this winter, there's not much you can do. Ukrainians, by the way, were also constrained in how much they could do. And that's why the Ukrainians began relying very, very heavily on masses of light infantry. And of course, that was the ideal outcome from the Russian standpoint. Please send us more living Ukrainians that we can slaughter. So this war of attrition has worn itself out. I think the bloodbath in Bakhmut has served its purpose. And the decision now is to await the end of the rains and then launch a serious Russian offensive. However, in the meantime, Mr. Zelensky has come under enormous pressure from Washington to build up a reserve of some size and hurl it against the Russian defenses. And I think he's been told, frankly, either you attack the Russians. A lot of people have been asking, well, what's wrong with this? In fact, the Russian population said, why don't you destroy these bridges over the Dnieper and just trap all these Ukrainian forces on the east side and kill them? There was never any response from the Russian general staff, and the Russian general staff does not usually share its plans. But the bottom line is those bridges are intact. And most of those bridges, particularly when you get up to this place called Dnipro, which I think used to be Dnipro, or frankly, you might as well arrange surrender terms. In other words, if you want to stay in the game and stay alive, you've got to sacrifice more Ukrainian soldiers in a pointless counterattack. The other thing that's happened over the last several months is almost total annihilation of the air defense network. It was never an integrated air defense system on the scale of the Russians, but they've reached the point now where there's almost no air defense. That means that your ground forces are open to all sorts of attack. And the Russians have also perfected, as you were intimating earlier, the integration of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms and complexes with the strike forces on the ground. So right now, there is nothing that can advance towards the Russians from the Ukrainian side without the Russians quickly identifying it, targeting it, and destroying it. And we've seen that in the most recent missile and air attacks over the last several days. But what's really important happened yesterday, and this is a point I want to make. All of your viewers will remember that the Russians have never destroyed the bridges over the Dnieper River. There is a very good bridge there that will support heavy armor, heavy equipment. But what the Russians did this weekend was very telling as to where we're headed. They attacked bridges on the border between Moldova and Ukraine and destroyed them with vast numbers of missiles. Now, why is this important? If you go to the Romanian border with Ukraine along the Black Sea, it's terrible. It's a terrible area to maneuver in, to move in. And the only good areas to move through, if you're going to move large numbers of troops, is to move up through southern Moldova and then over this very large bridge that was there for traffic. There's a rail bridge that was also destroyed, but it's primarily this very good bridge because that bridge is the link to Odessa. And what the Russians have just done is foreclose the NATO option of committing large ground forces through Romania and Moldova into southern Ukraine in the direction of Odessa. So Odessa is very definitely on the menu. Secondly, a buildup of Ukrainian forces down in Odessa has been detected, including 14 Leopard tanks. And these forces have now come under very determined attack by the Russians. So I think what we're witnessing now is the last stage before the great offensive, which is going to move north up to the Dnipro. And I think we'll see another massive movement across the Dnieper River and then south into Odessa. I think we'll see some movement through the center up through Bakhmut and that avenue of approach and further north and east towards Kharkov. Remember, there are about 300,000 forces down in the south with 200,000 more Russian reserves behind them, either in western Russia or behind those that are already in the south. And that doesn't include the 150,000 Russian troops sitting up in Belarusia. So the Russians have almost, I would say, an inexhaustible mountain of ammunition, missiles, rockets, aircraft, bombs, you name it. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, as has been pointed out, are running out of what they do have, which is not very much. And NATO and its allies, in other words, the Americans and the European allies, simply don't have additional equipment and weapons and munitions to send. And most of the equipment that we've been sending, for instance, additional tanks, some additional artillery ammunition, this is not going to make any difference when you are operating against an enemy that has perfected this ISR strike complex, which the Russians began talking about in the 1970s and has now become a reality. For the Russians, Ukraine is now something akin to a chessboard where everything is targeted. Nothing can be hidden. And if everything can be targeted, it can also be destroyed.
Interesting, fascinating in point of fact. Am I correct in thinking that Moldova's constitution prohibits foreign troops on its soil? And so I'm not quite sure. I realize that if the Americans want to do something like that they will go ahead and do it. But I'm not quite sure whether that, I don't think that would get much support from the Moldovan population, I don't think, would it?
Well, I'm shocked that you would suggest that the United States does not scrupulously obey international law. Obviously, if that's something we want to do, we would do it. And I know that we have sent lots of people over there to examine the roads. We have elements in the country. You're right. The Moldovan population does not want to be dragged into the Ukraine war by any means. And of course, you have this small group of Dniestrian Russians on the edge of Moldova, and a sort of autonomous, independent Dniestrian republic that also includes some Russian troops. I think the Ukrainians, who are hard-pressed to do much of anything now in eastern Ukraine, have wisely stayed away from that. But now that we see that the bridge is out, the major bridge, it was so vital and essential over the river that borders Moldova and Ukraine. And remember, all of these rivers in Eastern Europe are enormous. They're very different from what people think of in Western Europe. These things are enormous. And you just can't get over them easily unless you have substantial bridging equipment and so forth. So the U.S. forces that are down in Romania are now staring at a very difficult situation if somebody is prepping them to work their way into southern Ukraine. But again, you still have lots of NATO forces in Poland, particularly American forces, 40,000+, along with the Polish army, which has grown increasingly large. But we can come back to that, because as this Russian offensive takes off, once the Ukrainians have expended themselves, which I think is inevitable now, the Russians will then begin this deliberate move north. Kharkov will be taken. Odessa will come back under Russian control, because historically these are Russian cities. They were built by Russians and have been Russian since time immemorial.
Have we got an historical, and I'm playing slightly devil's advocate on this, if I may?
The rest of Ukraine, I suspect the Russians will wait to see if there is any interest in any kind of negotiation before they complete the conquest and march to the Polish border.
Historical analogies at all? I mean, Bakhmut is telling me, is whispering in my ear, this is Verdun in 1916, with and the Germans bleeding the French army on the anvil of Verdun. This seems to me to be a strategic play by the Russians, bringing them in to destroy them, and actually, as you say, not cutting anything off, because Zelensky or the regime or Washington are actually playing the Russians' game at the moment, and their doctrine is to destroy the opposition army, not to hold ground, which is not of any particularly great tactical value. So I sort of see a little bit Verdun, and if I may just add to that question before you pick up on it, because I know you're an expert in these historical things. Is there another analogy, perhaps, that we did see the Germans run out of puff in 1918 with the Kaiser's offensive, and the last 100 days came to open warfare, and it was wrapped up, of course, by November the 11th. We also saw, didn't we, the German attack when we thought they'd run out of puff, we thought they didn't have anything left in the bag, air cover in particular, and the Allies had total command of the air. But they still fought through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, and they still were continuing fighting when they retreated past the Rhine, notwithstanding the horrendous losses in the Falaise Gap. Is there any possibility of history repeating itself in any mutated form in this way?
Well, the problem with the Verdun analogy is that the Germans took, I would say, serious losses, inflicting heavy losses on the French. In fact, through most of the war, for every 2 British or French casualties, there was 1 German. That was pretty much the average. The Germans outfought the British and the French continuously. They outfought us. In fact, we never did very well against the Germans in Europe. We never improved the ratio of kills beyond 1-to-1, despite overwhelming firepower. I think a better analogy might be 1943 in the spring.